Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm so excited to have the great filmmaker Todd Haynes, who actually this is his first feature-length music doc, The Velvet Underground. Welcome, Todd. Always such a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Roger. It's so great to be here. I wish we could all be together in the flesh.
Well, there'll be other opportunities down the road.
Farewell.
Tell us when you decided on the approach of the film that people have seen the film is a total immersive experience. We're embodying the experimental feel of the times in the making. When did you decide to go that route?
I have to say it was pretty early on in the whole question of doing a documentary about the Velvet Underground, which was sort of offered to me as an invitation. And I sort of instinctively, I just said, yes, absolutely. Of course, I would love to figure this out, knowing that it would come with innate challenges and things that we don't really have with the Velvets like you do with other famous bands. But what you do have with the Velvets that you have with no famous bands in the history of popular music, I guarantee you, is this unbelievable culture of the avant-garde cinema that was going on at the same time in New York City. And beyond that, a cultural community that was so interlaced and so attentive and interested in what people were doing in the neighboring mediums of art all around them, that you had this just remarkable, and clearly one just has to stop for a second and say, okay, we're talking about the 1960s in general, where a lot of that energy was evident in music making and filmmaking and a lot of creative production and political activity throughout the country and the world. This was a unique time, no doubt. Mm-hmm. But within that, there was something even more distinct and in many ways oppositional and marginal, as we were just discussing, about what was happening in New York and what was happening around the Warhol factory. And mm-hmm. That's where this music came from. And so it just was an invitation to really get into the fiber and the kind of lifeblood of this time and place. And that in that, if you were looking at it from that standpoint, all of a sudden the visual opportunities for a film became actually infinite rather than limited. Mm-hmm. So we just embraced what we had really in our laps with this culture.
And you do something very tricky where we're used to seeing documentaries where the narration is linear. But instead, the narrative becomes almost like a collage. Was that challenging to keep of course there was a narrative, but it is nonlinear.
I mean, it's pretty, when you really analyze it, I would say it's somewhat linear in that it starts with the childhoods of Lou Reed and John Cale, and it tracks them in their various trajectories to New York. But I think what was tantamount to me it was a balancing act, because the interviews are essential and important, and I'm really proud of the results. We got such amazing stuff from these amazing people, right? And I was also, one can't help be aware of the fact that these are people who are in some ways time travelers, or they survived this very distant time that a lot of people haven't survived, and they're old.
Right.
And you see the history of their lives and that survival on their faces. But for some reason, they all seem so ready to share their stories in this film. So we had that amazing material, but I think my goal with my editors, Afonso Gonçalves and Adam Kernitz, was to always kind of let the narratives follow, be behind the music and the images. so that the audience had a chance to sort of feel like they were almost receiving the narrative information intuitively, and that their observation and their seeing Lou Reed in a screen test and then seeing a early Warhol film and hearing the drone experimentations of Lamont Young, all of a sudden you, the viewer, are making connections between the ideas and the experiments that were being swapped around at the time. And it makes it, hopefully what we hoped is it would make the viewer really feel like they were kind of finding their own way in the movie and it wasn't being handed to you on a plate.
I mean this in the nicest way possible. There is a destabilizing quality to watching the split screen and also the flickering tones. Was that something that you wanted to push and eventually found how much of that you could show?
Well, yeah, I think we wanted to take to heart a lot of the visual experimentation that was going on in the filmmaking, but also in the music, realizing that among the film artists that were showing in this film, Warhol, Jack Smith, Jonas Mekas, Marie Rankin, Barbara Rubin, Kenneth Anger, on and on and on, and also some classic artists from earlier years, Fischinger and Van der Beek and Maya Deren, and is that this encompasses a really wide range of stylistic languages in non-narrative filmmaking. So no one's films look like anybody else's, except that they're just not conventional narratives. That's the only thing they really share. And so what we wanted to show is like both the quiet, slow, durational kinds of examples of what they were doing, and then show the aggressive, fast cut, multi-layered, frenetic side of what they were doing, and a lot of other examples in between. And that you would feel sort of aspects of all of this in the music of the Velvets. So you could feel that they were responding to both almost the zone out heroin-induced music making and the high-speed frenetics of amphetamine-induced filmmaking, and not to put it all on the drugs, but there were different moods that were being expressed in the music.
There is so many things that I feel I discover when I was watching the film. Like for example, the West Coast hippie counterculture, and then the fact that you contrast this urban decadent creative world juxtaposed with the hippie culture. Was that something you were aware of or you discovered during the making of the film?
No, it was something I really, really wanted to sort of underscore in the film, which was how much a kind of queer, gay counterculture was at the foundation of what was happening in New York City, whether you were gay or not. It was sort of at the core of the sort of ethos of popism, of camp culture, of the Warhol factory scene, and of a kind of euphoric idea of bringing together all of these contrasting people from different sectors of the society, from the street to the heights of the art collector world, the Upper West Side. Gay people, straight people, Black people, white people, like a real coming together of what was happening in the sort of vital coexistence of the artistic scene in New York. And so, that felt like something that people forget when a band like this becomes as canonized as it is, how sort of gay it was. And like, Mary Warnoff would say, when she talked about the West Coast, she'd say, like, we'd go there and it would be like, they'd be these earth mothers baking bread and talking about, oh, wow, look at the light and the Buddha. And we were reading books and watching movies and talking a mile a minute And she says they were homophobic and we were homosexual. And she made those distinctions in the way she talked about the two cultures, not because she was a lesbian, because she wasn't, but she identified with the ideas and the sort of framing of the world that came out of a queer point of view.
Mhm. New York becomes another character as well in the documentary. You show us the urban decadence, the seedy Manhattan in the 60s. Can you tell us about developing that side of the story?
Well, yeah, it was really the touchstone place for so many different kinds of people. And when you just look at the range of people in the Velvet Underground alone, from John Cale from Wales studying avant-garde music with an electronic viola, to the Long Island contingency of Lou Reed and Sterling Morrison and Maureen Tucker, to Nico, imported from Germany as this sort of international star, but this woman with such complex and dark sort of artistic leanings that she would move on to a solo career, the likes of which you can't really compare with any other artist, that she really had a lot going well before they even realized what she was capable of. So that just brought together so many different people. But as I was just saying, what was brought together in New York, in the factory, was this sort of safe zone for people to all come together and participate in all this pretty hyped up art making, like that sense of making things. This was hardly a slacker attitude. It was really like, you got to keep working and producing and doing all this stuff with a real sense that yesterday was gone and that they were committing to a new world that was open to new ideas and new forms of expression. Warhol talks about this really eloquently. And he said, and I think in many ways, it's sort of like what happens when you have a concept like popism, after which you can never go to a supermarket and see it the same way again. You can never drive across country and look at the signage and the neon and the Americana again without seeing it in this framework. And I think that framework made you feel like you were crossing into the new world. Mm-hmm. And you could be a part of that new world or you could not. And they all wanted to be a part of it.
One of the exhilarating aspects for me watching your film is how these different mediums were coexisting and inspiring one another. Has there been anything like it where you had musicians inspiring painters and dancers inspiring each other in such a coexistence?
It's hard, isn't it, to find examples like that? I mean, it's hard to find anything quite that intense and that defined by such a small sort of, location in geography as New York at that time. But I do think whenever you look at sort of strong moments of artistic production, like the 1920s and, the Harlem Renaissance era and, the origins of jazz and what they all share, whether they were affecting as many mediums of art as we're talking about in the 60s, but they all share this sense of a combustion of a lot of people in the same time and place. And people literally hanging out with each other and going to the same shows and going to the same venues. So the audience was also, it was like you couldn't tell the dancer from the dance. Everybody was sort of a participant. And that creates something really, really unique. And I do think we are challenged today by our remoteness from each other and how used to that we've become and how that can be, there's great advantages to technology that we obviously all live in now, but there's also costs in the ways that we don't interact and we don't feel each other quite as closely as at other times historically.
For obvious reasons, you couldn't have interviewed Lou Reed because, he was dead. We hear the voices, we hear John Cale and of course, Mo. Did you, when you were putting the film together, did you miss not having Lou Reed be part of the story?
Yeah. We miss Lou Reed every day. And anytime I heard, because we scoured all the recorded interviews that were available of Lou and anything that he ever said about the Velvet Underground, is stuff that is mostly in the film. And it wasn't quite as much as I would have thought. I think usually he'd be doing interviews about his next solo record, and that's what he'd talk about. But there were times I would hear tapes that Danny Fields had recorded of Lou, and Danny was a dear friend of Lou's, and Lou trusted him. He wasn't like talking to a journalist when he was talking to Danny. And you get this guy, this person comes through that you don't always get in the interviews. This person of such remarkable intelligence and wit, such a kind of hunger and excitability about music and art making. And one conversation in particular I think about a lot is when he first heard the Ramones, who Danny Fields had just discovered, and he played the Ramones to Lou Reed before they were ever released as a band. And Lou lost his mind and it was like reminding him of everything that made him want to make music. And the love and the excitement and the infectiousness of it was unmistakable. And he said early on in that conversation, John would just go crazy for this.
Wow.
And it gives you chills because you realize that he's always thinking about John Cale. Even when they'd been years separated or had a fight or another altercation or whatever, that primary formative thing that happens when you're that age and you're open to everything and you're sharing so much doesn't ever really go away.
Did you get to meet Lou Reed? Because I know that in Velvet Goldmine, your film,
Yeah.
you use a Lou Reed song. Did you have an interaction with Lou Reed?
No, we didn't. I was always too scared. I mean, I would see Lou Reed at events in New York and like openings of the Whitney Biennial or something, and he'd be there with Laurie Anderson, and we were just like in the corner going, "Oh my God, it's Lou Reed," But I didn't have the balls or the whatever, maybe stupidity to go up and throw myself at him. But when we asked him for Satellite of Love for Velvet Underground, he was one of the fastest yeses that we received. And of course, Bowie had said no to us entirely for anything of his for that movie, which was an homage to him. But Lou said yes. And I took that as probably for more than it meant, but I took it as some sense that maybe he knew my work and I will say one small note on that. Brian Ferry and Brian Eno were both a part of Velvet Underground, and we invited them to the Cannes premiere of Velvet Underground. Velvet Goldmine, sorry.
Velvet Goldmine. Yeah.
Velvet Goldmine. It's easy to do that when you're me. We were at Cannes for the premiere of Velvet Goldmine 1998. We invited Brian Ferry and Brian Eno, and they had not been talking to each other. When Eno left Roxy Music, it left many, many years of kind of conflict between the two. They both came, they both sat right behind me during the premiere. And I was just, half my head was enjoying my movie, and the other half just wanted to hear what the Bryans would say at any point. During Satellite of Love, the only thing they said through the whole movie is, "That's such a beautiful song. Oh, isn't it?"
But he must have, Lou Reed, approved of you because, I mean, he must have seen the movie, right? Velvet Goldmine.
I think Lou was an incredibly voracious consumer of culture and film and art and what was happening in New York. And I think he really loved going out and seeing stuff. Beyond that, I can't tell you for
right.
Sure, but it would be, yeah, I like thinking that. I also like, because Laurie Anderson had agreed to putting my name out as a director on this project, that it came from something. If Lou Reed hated my movies, she probably wouldn't have wanted to offer this to me.
Seeing the credits, there's so much archival footage. You got stuff from the Warhol Foundation, from the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Public Library. How difficult was it to amass all the archival footage? And also, putting it all together, was it a challenge?
It was the best and most enjoyable challenge and part of the process. And I literally, my editors, Fonzie and Adam, and I was cutting as well. We were just every day like going, we don't want this to ever end. This is just it's just such an incredibly rich and inspiring process and subject and strategy for how to tell this story that we just loved being immersed in these films. Putting together the original list of films started with my archival producer and partner, Brian O'Keefe, who really put together the first master list of all the relevant films that we would want to put together in our database. And that would grow as we went to different archival houses and established relationships with the Warhol Museum. That was the most important, but with Jonas as well at Anthology Film Archives and on and on and on. The hardest part of the process logistically was clearances and getting masters, because it was during COVID. So most of these archive houses, which are already minimally staffed, were even more cut back during COVID. So it took such a long time and such an unbelievable work on the part of Motto, the team of Motto Pictures, our producing partners on this, who were just really incredible partners in every possible way. There's no way Christine Vachon and I could have figured this out without those guys guiding us through every step of it.
So when it comes to putting it together, I mean, you mentioned your editors. Did you feel that it was, now you're making a documentary feature is different from the other films that you've made, or was there similarities?
There really were more similarities, or at least I would say, Roger, it confirmed that feeling that every movie is its own unique set of challenges, opportunities, histories, because my films are almost always set in the past. So there's a exploration of the past that goes on, in making them, researching it. And in films that I've made that are fictional films in the past that were about artistic subjects and real people, like Velvet Goldmine, inspired by the glam rock artists, or I'm Not There, inspired by
Bob Dylan,
or even Superstar, inspired by Karen Carpenter. In all those cases, I was tasked with, I took on the challenge of telling these stories and just making films about musical artists. But I think I felt the only way to really do that was through circuitous, fictionalized versions where we have 6 actors playing 7 Bob Dylan archetypes, where you create a sort of parallel history to the glam rock era, sort of inspired by Citizen Kane and the inability to ever really know the truth about a famous person's life. And you instead get a series of opinions and conflicting points of view about them. And with Karen Carpenter telling it through a sort of form of playing with dolls and sort of putting it back in the hands of the viewer, we've all played with dolls and told our own stories about ourselves and our bodies and our desires through these other means. So yeah, I always found out that I had to escape reality or recreate reality in one way or another anyway. And here we were telling the story of a band that didn't really have any footage of the band. Amazing stills, but no traditional footage of them performing live or all the things that you would usually start with in a music doc. So again, we had to kind of invent it through circuitous parallel means and try to make that really count. And in some ways, I always think then the viewer has to do all the conjuring themselves. It gives the viewer this really direct role in how to bring it to life for themselves. Because let's face it, no matter how well made a movie is, how great an actor it is, if it doesn't happen inside you, the movie doesn't work. Correct. If the movie doesn't give you something to feel and do and figure out yourself, it hasn't done anything. It happens in the viewer, not on the screen all by itself.
Did you find that it was liberating, the fact that you'd never done a documentary before, and then all of a sudden you're making your own rules and breaking them as well?
It was inspiring. I think it was just like, it was always guided by how inspired we were by the time and era that we were describing and the music making that was happening by these artists. So we had something very specific to hold ourselves up to and to say, this is what they were doing. They were putting two images together, Andy Warhol in Chelsea Girls. And once he did that, he continued to do diptych films from then on. So then there were other artists around the 60s who were doing multiple screens on a frame and using the optical printer to play with multiple images all at once. And then that trickled into feature filmmaking, like Richard Fleischer's Boston Strangler, which uses multi-frame compositions, as does Woodstock, the documentary.
Correct.
And many other feature films would start to steal these ideas and bring them into the mainstream more. But it was all happening in the avant-garde. And so that just became our constant sort of touchstone for what seemed possible, and the sheer energy of rule breaking and trying it a different way, I think made us all feel liberated.
And now you got the bug and you're continuing doing another documentary about Peggy Lee?
Oh no, that's a feature film. That's a
it is a feature.
Yeah. No. I don't have any documentaries in my docket at the moment. This one, again, I think this one will be its own unique set of terms and conditions and materials to play with that I don't expect to repeat. But it was I had so much fun. We all had a lot of fun making it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it got shortlisted for documentary. Which is well deserved. Well deserved. So the Peggy Lee, you're in production right now?
We are trying to keep that thing afloat amid the recent Omicron stuff, which is just shutting down productions. And it's still affecting practices, regardless of it being a more mild strain of the virus. It's still affecting the reality of production protocols in a very real way. So studios are having to grapple with that. So it's just been a super challenging series of years where the terms keep changing and people have to keep figuring out how to get back to what they do.
Well, you will persevere. Always a delight, Todd, to talk to you.
Likewise, Roger.
I'm a great admirer of what you do, and I cannot wait for the next project.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Stay well.
I appreciate it. You too.